In this video I'm covering the game between Alireza Firouzja and Mustafa Yilmaz from European Team Championship. The opening was knight dwarf. We have the one with bishop e3. Yilmaz chose e5, knight b3, bishop e6, and now queen d2. White is preparing to castle along and to launch some kind of attack. The main battle in the knight dwarf in this variation is who is going to capture the d5 square. And if black doesn't manage to win this battle for d5 square, he usually relies on something else, maybe some kind of counterattack on the queen side or something similar. In this position, he plays knight bd7, castles, bishop e7, and now h3. Stopping any knight g4s, and because now white doesn't have bishop g5, so he has to stop knight g4. And also preparing g4. The reason why he didn't play f3 immediately, because f3 does the same. It prepares g4, but white wants to be flexible. He wants to push g4 and then keep an option for a move like f4 later on. And you'll see why is that important. b5, g4, and now rook c8. King b1, and now knight b6. c4 square is always a nice outpost for black's pieces. And now g5. And this seems like black is getting his knight very nice on h5. White has h4 and black finally gets knight c4. He takes and rook takes. And now you might think that white doesn't have any attack on the king side. Knight on h5 is doing a great job of blocking it. But in return, white got the d5 square, which is also very important. After a move like bc, white would go to c1, queen d7 would be played, and after a move like knight d5, bishop d8 is very good, because if he castles immediately, then you take on d6, losing a pawn. So you need to play first bishop d8 before castling, knight e2. After castling, you can go to c3 back to attack the d6 pawn, and after rook c6 you have f4. And this is the point, to kick this knight away, and also to somehow target the pawn on d6. Now the bishop on e6 feels very uncomfy, because the f5 is very big threat here, and also to capture on e5. So black has to do it, because if he tries something like queen c7, then f5 would be really unpleasing for black, because he would need to go back, and now knight d5 would be very ugly for black. So after f4 he has to capture, because if he wants to keep the bishop on e6, he needs to capture. Takes, you can play something like bishop g4, but it doesn't really matter. In the end you will exchange the knight on h5, so let's say this, and white is still slightly better. But also he has to be careful about a potential attack on the b file. To me it seemed more logical to take with the b pawn than with the bishop. After this, Alireza plays knight d5, and now black still has the same problem. He wants to develop, he wants to castle on the king side, but after castling he would just lose his d6 pawn after taking on d6. And after this you can capture on e4, but now the a6 pawn is also under attack. Knight c5 might come next, and it's not recommendable to play this. Rook e4 is not good because of bishop b6. And after a move like queen b8, to go here, now knight c6 is a big threat, or just to capture on e7 and fork the queen. And after bishop d7 to stop knight c6, now f3, and the rook is simply trapped. If rook a4, then b3. Have to sacrifice it somehow. Probably it's best to sacrifice it on f4, but still it's a big material disadvantage to black. In the game, what happened was that black took on d5 and surrendered the d5 square. Of course, it is going to be hard to transfer the knight from b3 to d5 in few moves. It has to go to e3 or c3, which at this moment is not really feasible. But white finds other ways to increase his advantage. Also, he can just keep the d5 square with his heavy pieces, which is quite enough, because knight on h5 cannot challenge them in any way. If it goes to f4, you can just capture it, and it's quite okay. Black plays queen c7, and now white goes back. Now if black captures on c2, then rook c1 is forcing trade on the c file, after which it's impossible for black to even castle. Because if he goes to d7, then knight f3 is very strong, And in case of castling, then knight e5 loses the pawn. Bishop on e7 is dead. Queen on d5 is dominating everything on the board. Knight on h5 is quite useless. So that would be quite bad for black. Rook c6 instead. And now rook c1. Castles and now c3. Now he wants to double on the c file. The king side is locked. And white is switching to the queen side, which is a very interesting idea in the Najdorf, to focus the game on the side where the king is castled. Now black plays g6, rook c2, and now rook b8, rook hc1, and now a5 was played. And here Alireza plays b4. If he just passes with a4, then I think that a3 would be just fine. Next move is going to be c4, and white would probably force the ending. Some exchange of pieces with c4, exchanging this pawn for this, and just dominating on the c file. The b pawn would be a passed pawn. It wouldn't be so appetizing to play. Instead, he wanted to keep the tension with rook c8, and here Alireza plays a4, which was a bad move. It was much better to take on b5. It looks very risky to play such a move because you get your king in some kind of danger, but that's all illusion, because if black plays rook b8 here, queen a4, and next move is going to be a3, covering b4 square. Also, b5 is a strong threat next move, and just locking down this queen side. So b5 might come next. In case of some move like this, you can take it, and now black is forced to capture on c2, rook c2, and next is going to be a3. And the white's king is perfectly fine. Black cannot really use slightly exposed position of white's king. And also notice that knight is going to head towards d5, and once it gets there, it's game over because the bishop will get locked out permanently. So instead, he plays a4 here. Yilmaz makes a huge mistake here and takes on b4 and misses a very nice tactic. This is a really nice tactic he blundered. If he took on a4 instead, and white plays b5, for example, after queen b8, c4, knight f4 now would happen, and white is forced to capture on f4 because the queen is trapped on d5. So after capturing, takes king a2. Now after rook c5, king d3, bishop f8, black's bishop would suddenly be a very active participant, and it would not be so easy for white to use his advantage, because there are all sorts of tactics that hang in the air. With bishop on g7, b2 square might be vulnerable. When the bishop comes to e5, I don't see an easy way to break through in the center or on the queen side. Instead, Yilmaz took on b4. Can you pause the video to find the move which Alireza played in the game? It is a really nice move. The winning move was queen c6. And now after queen takes, he just takes on b4. And now black has to choose. Does he want to keep the queen on the board, or does he want to exchange to give material back? If he keeps the queen on the board, if it goes, let's say, to a6, then you take the rook, king g7, and now a5. And what does black do? If he tries d5 with the idea of, if white captures, to go bishop b4, to have some kind of counterattack, then white goes rook c6. After queen b7, now a6 is very strong. After a7, white is going to promote and get checkmate on g8. In the game, black chose to give the material back and go rook b8. If he exchanges rooks also and takes on a4, now the b pawn is going to run, and after bishop d8 to stop the pawn, just b6, b7, bishop a7, and promote on b8 and take the bishop. So he chose to do rook b8, but now the a pawn is a passed pawn. Now black wants to somehow distract white, and he plays knight f4, trying to increase his drawing chances, but white doesn't care about this knight. At this moment the a pawn is very strong. First, white goes rook c7, attacking the bishop and also putting his rook on the active square, bishop d8, and now rook d7, attacking the d6 pawn and keeping this rook tied to the bishop. Knight d3, targeting the b4 pawn. Now a6. He takes on b4, but now a7, and after rook a8 he takes on d6. And now the idea is simple, to go rook d7, rook b7, and rook b8, to force the trade of rooks, or just to force rook to take on a7 and to give up itself. Here black tries bishop c7, but after rook d7, knight a6 to somehow block the 7th rank. Now he has rook d5, he's attacking the b5 pawn, and after bishop a5, he goes to b3, and in this position black resigned because he's simply paralyzed in this position. First, if he goes to c3 to defend the pawn on e5, now white can just capture, and the knight on a6 is doomed. If you try king f8, rook b6, and after knight moves to, let's say, c7 to defend the rook, you can do rook b8, king e7, and bishop b6. And if the knight moves, then you take the rook. If you go closer with the king, you can take on c7, and that's it. And if bishop c7, then rook takes b5. And when the king comes closer, you can see that black is totally paralyzed here. His rook on a8 is forced to stay there on the 8th rank to protect from the a pawn. If king c6 to get even closer, knight a5 is very strong, and if bishop takes, rook a5. If knight goes back to c7, then you can capture on e5 and slowly start pushing on the king side, also creating a passed pawn, winning this game. On the other hand, the king has to be here because if it gets away, then king can just jump in. That's why Yilmaz resigned this position. Thank you so much for watching and have a nice day. Bye.